spotlight my video too. There. So hello, welcome. Thanks for joining. And we'll start just with a moment or two with our eyes closed. Take a good seat. Close your eyes. And take the first few moments here to settle, to arrive. Let the weight of your body release more fully down into the seat on which you are sitting. Feel into the central column of the torso. And with the next breath in, lightly lengthen the torso from the base of the pelvis to the crown of the head. Soften the jaw and the eyes. And just for a moment or two, tune into the breath. And use these opening moments here to fully settle into this space and time that we've created for contemplation and conversation around the teachings of yoga and for the process and practice of meditation. Then, with your next exhale, either keep your hands as they are or join your hands together at your heart. And we'll chant Om once to initiate the space. Take a full breath in. Bow your head to your heart. Release your hands down. Lift your head up. Hello, Sherry. So we're beginning tonight a 5-part series. And so this first part is on creation. Sages, mystics, and contemplatives of various traditions and throughout time have wrestled with the questions of how are we born and what happens when we die. And the models that they established answered those questions. And tonight we'll explore the model presented in the non-dual Tantrik philosophy. Imagine a disheveled, wild man with dreadlocks who is dancing a frenzied, somewhat even chaotic dance. And that dance is freeze-framed for a moment when he is balanced on one foot on top of a small imp with his forearms in positions around him, his hair, the dreadlocks streaming out from his head from the of his head. And at the same time, his gaze in that freeze frame is very centered and steady, and his face is soft and serene. He is Shiva, Lord of the Dance, Shiva Nataraja, and he represents in the way that he's positioned and also the implements or the various objects that he holds in his hands. He represents the worldview presented in the Tantric philosophy of how are we born, what happens when we die, and how a mysterious situation, how does it come to be? In the Tantric philosophy, or in the Indian culture, it's only relatively recently that the universal force representing the flow of life, birth, life, and death, is represented in a male figure. And there are specific goddess-centric sects in the Tantric philosophy that recognized that the one universal energy, who ultimately has no gender, is beyond gender, is more accurately portrayed in a feminine form, recognizing the inherent capacity of the female form to birth, to create life. And so we might, for the purpose of our conversation tonight, that the image of Shiva is the goddess, the divine feminine, masquerading as a male figure in this dance. So the first part of Shiva's 5 acts of his dance is the act of creation. And that's represented by the object he's holding in his upper right hand. It's a small, round drum, and it's the kind of drum that has a handle, a little drum, and then 2 strings with mallets on the end. And it's used like this, with a movement of the hand that knocks the mallets against one side of the drum and then the other. So the drum creates a pulse, and that pulse is recognized as the inherent and primordial pulse of the universe. It is what we find in the heartbeat and what pushes the inhale and the exhale through our bodies. And that pulse and the heartbeat is represented by the drum that Shiva is holding and swinging as he is dancing. To more deeply explore the understanding of creation in this paradigm, we'll use the metaphor of the ocean. So imagine that the ocean is this vast expanse of water, and mysteriously there's impulses that move the water and pull the water up into a wave, and then at moments that wave subsides back into the expanse of the ocean. When each wave is formed, there's no question that it's made up of the water of the ocean. It's recognized as completely intrinsically the same. Even though for a moment it has this unique characteristic of a wave shape, a wave form, and isn't quite the same as the body of the ocean. So the Tantric philosophers say that's the exact same thing with creation. The expanse of the universe, there's this impulse that takes the very fabric of the universe and molds it into form. And it molds it into forms that are human, and it molds us into all the forms that we see in the world around us. With the metaphor of the wave and the ocean, and there being no question that the wave is also inherently made up of the material of the ocean, then there is no question that each of the forms that we see and each of the forms that we are also inherently made up of the same material as the universe out of which we were created. And that's a really significant teaching, that we are not separate from or different from the universe out of which we arose, out of which we were formed. So that's a thing to spend some time with. And this process of creation happens on all levels. So it's the process where out of space galaxies are formed, the process that molds everything that we see in the external world. And it's also a process that is happening inside us all the time. For example, in the ocean of the mind, thoughts arise and they dissolve. There's a creative process happening every time a thought pops up in our mind and then dissolves away at some point again. If we consider the process of creation that's happening inside us a little more deeply, or more specifically, in the recognition that the mind is actively involved in this creative process, we come to understand that it is the mind that is creating all that we see in the world around us. So we're saying that this is a table, there's a picture, this is a tree. We have created language to describe what we're seeing, and so we're ultimately building our reality in that way. In creating common language, we're allowing connection and communication around what is being created. At the same time, each of us has a very unique and specific perspective that is built or created through our own unique set of experiences and qualities. There's an image, and hopefully many of you have seen it. There's an image, and if not, you can Google it. An image that shows an old woman and a young woman. And depending on how we look at the image, we see one of those two perspectives right away. So some of us, when we look at this image, will see the old woman, and she's got a large nose and kind of a pointy chin, and she's wrinkled, and that's the perspective. That's what our mind creates right away. We see this image and we think, that's it. This is a picture of an old woman. And because our mind has also the tendency to hold on and believe that what it's creating is the most accurate representation of the world that it's seeing, it locks in. And it says, okay, I'm seeing this picture of an old woman. Other people looking at the same image will see a picture of a very beautiful young woman with a hat, and will not see the old woman in the same way that people seeing the old woman will not see the picture of the beautiful young woman. So this tendency to lock into one perspective and not see both. But then when it's pointed out, if we look at this image and it's pointed out that there's these two different ways to perceive the same image, then we can never not see it. It's a little like, I have the version of my life story, the storyline that I have created, and my siblings, my sisters, who have shared similar events to me, and let's take one event in the family history, I will have created a representation of that experience that might be very different from theirs. In fact, they might not even remember some of the things that I have created as significant aspects of our shared childhood together. So the mind is actively and continuously invested in this process of creation and of constantly creating the world in which we see, and in which we interact and experience. So because of that, it can be a very interesting exercise at some point, and you might contemplate this. It can be a very interesting exercise to take a particular story from your life and to tell it in various ways. So we have this infinite creative potential. And like I said, our mind has a tendency to lock into one perspective and limit the infinite creative potential. So if we take a story from our life, we can tell it as a drama, as a tragedy, as a comedy. And each version of that same event told with this specific flavor has accuracy. It has truth. It might not be the whole truth, but it has truth. And that's an invitation to allow our mind to hold its full, unlimited creative potential. In recognizing the mind's capacity for creativity and to censor what we see and what we take in, and to build perspectives and narratives around only one kind of limited aspect of what is possible. Many meditations, especially in this tradition, use the creative potential of the mind and harness it in specific ways. So we're asked to visualize and to meditate on a particular image or a particular action inside the body, and that's to take the creative potential of the mind and direct it, so that the mind, instead of just kind of chaotically creating everything constantly, thought trains, ideas about what we're seeing, ideas about what's right or wrong, labels, all of that, the inherent and infinite creative capacity of the mind. And meditation techniques that invite us to visualize specific images, harness that creative potential, and allow us to build more coherency within the creative potential. So we're directing the potential of the mind toward these images that lead us toward the recognition that we are ultimately the fabric of the universe, that we are ocean molded into wave, as opposed to thinking that we are separate, distinct waves. And that's the invitation of the meditation practice. So comments or thoughts about that understanding of creation? You can, if you're on Zoom, you could unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can raise your hand and I will see you. If you're on Facebook, you can type in a question or comment. So then we will move into our practice. So take a moment to adjust your seat in any way that is useful, in that it allows your body weight to settle more fully and your torso to lengthen. Oh, sorry, question. Yes, Virginie? you want to unmute yourself? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead. Are you hearing me, Virginie? Huh. Keep going. I think so. If every individual is... if I understand the question, it's, are you referring to like what is the impulse that ultimately starts the wave moving into form? That's a good question. That's a good question. So the question is, if I understand it, so if I am made out of or created by the ocean, do I have any separate ability to act or decide that's separate from the ocean, right? Yeah, so the understanding here is that it is the rhythm of the ocean that is governing the decisions, and that the will of the universe moves through us. I think that, this is a very complicated question, and I'm not sure that I really have the capacity to answer it fully. So I think we have free agency, that we can make decisions and live separately in the same way that we think that we are separate beings, not waves in an ocean. And so as a consequence, there's the sense that we have choice over what we do. And at the same time, we were formed out of the ocean, out of the impulse of the ocean to move into wave, as opposed to the wave wanting to become a wave. This is the ocean that said, that the impulse that creates the wave comes out of the depths of the ocean and travels up, and then the wave forms. But what has moved that happens deep in the ocean. It's not just from the surface. So the kind of pulls and pushes and the impulses that create our actions, we perceive them as separate and distinct and our own. And yet, we are ultimately of the ocean and moved by the ocean. Yeah, I think perhaps like there's a way that that's also a bit voluntary as well as involuntary. It's a little like the breath, right? So the breath moves involuntarily, like there's this impulse that's pressing the breath through us. And at the same time, we can kind of mold it to some extent. We can't stop it and we can't start it, but we have some capacity to mold it. So maybe that's a good way to think about our free will, that it's not total free will, but it's still some sense to mold or direct the impulse. What do you think about that? Thank you. Interesting question. Other comments or questions before we Liddy? Are you unmuting yourself? Yeah. Hmm. 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 Should. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. No. No. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful. Beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very beautiful experience. And and possibly also invites the contemplation of, how much do these choices really, if they take us ultimately kind of where we need to go, right? That we think we're deciding like, oh, is this one the better one or this one the better one? And yet if we just kind of allow life to flow through us, we're going to go where we need to go, whether we take road A or road B, whether we turn left or we turn right. It's going to take us exactly where we were intended to go from the beginning. And it's interesting contemplation. One of the things that comes up for me when you were sharing is around, how much could we have made a different decision at any moment? At any moment, I really believe that we make the best decision that we can make under the circumstances that we find ourselves in that moment. And so, is there really another decision possible, even if we spend all this time agonizing over it? And so I have. And then the other piece around that is, if we are like the driftwood being kind of carried in the currents of the ocean, how much energy do we spend fighting against the currents, and how much energy can we save if we move with it? Those are maybe taking us a little bit away from creation. Thank you, Liddy, for sharing that. So maybe now we'll come to practice. So we're going to use a visualization practice tonight, and it's to visualize a multi-petaled flower in the center of the heart. The traditional image is a lotus flower, similar to a water lily, but any other flower that you can visualize or feel, have a sense of in the center of you would be appropriate. And you're going to visualize it. Will take a few minutes to form the image as fully as possible. Some of us more naturally can hold visual images inside with clarity, and other people have much more facility to kind of feel into. So you want to do whichever of those works better for your body system, mind, and those 2 or 3 ideas to imagine, to visualize, or to feel into are the same process in the tradition. And so we're using our mental powers of creativity, directing them and holding them in the creation of this image. And then we'll use the breath to inhale and invite the petals of the lotus to expand a little bit, and the exhale to contract. Over subsequent breath, the petals move more out on the inhale, then they move in on the exhale, so that the lotus or the flower comes more and more and more into full bloom over the process of the meditation. And then at some point, we'll let the image dissolve so that we can rest as much as possible, have some sense of our oceanness. So we're using the image of the flower to train our creative potential of the mind toward knowing our oceanness instead of getting caught up in our wave self. So adjust your seat, close your eyes. And take a few breaths to let yourself settle. Again, releasing the weight of the body down so that the parts of you that touch your seat come to rest a little more deeply against your seat. Imagine a central column that runs from the base of the pelvis through the center of the torso and comes out the crown of the head and extends upward about a foot above the crown of the head. Imagine, visualize, or feel into that line. It runs just in front of the anatomical spine and is really positioned centrally in the torso, front to back and side to side. As you feel into that central column, relax the belly, release the jaw, and soften the eyes. For a moment, touch into the point at the bottom of that central column, the base of the pelvis. And also bring your attention to the other end, to the point about a foot above the crown of the head. And find the very center in between those two poles, the very center of you, and in the heart of your form, create an image of a many-petaled lotus flower or another flower that's in bud. Take a moment to visualize, imagine, or feel into that image of a bud beginning to open into flower in the center of you. As you visualize it or feel into it, connect to the color that it is. Traditional colors would be cobalt blue or translucent white, sparkling with silver and gold. And to visualize or feel into the texture and shape of the petals. Now become aware of your breath. And And as you inhale, watch the breath in. Tease open the petals of the flower. Let the exhale slightly close the petals back in toward bud. Let the next breath in gently expand open the petals. And let the exhale close them back in. Continue to hold this visualization, this image, this felt sense with the breath. So that as you harness the mind's infinite creative potential and direct it toward the flower image, expanding, opening with the inhale, slightly closing with the exhale. The image grows clearer. And the flower moves more and more and more into bloom. Whenever your mind's creativity shifts you into other thought patterns, storylines, come back to the image or the felt sense and deliberately harness the mind's creativity and direct it in this way. Continuing to unfurl the flower petals on the inhale. Let the petals soften and slightly close toward the center on the exhale. let the specifics of the image dissolve. Let go of the felt sense a little bit, but hold your attention anchored in your heart. Paying attention to your ocean nature. As opposed to the waves of thought. And whenever the waves of thought pull your attention away from your center, bring your attention back to your heart. And at any point recreate that image of the flower opening and closing with the breath, to continue to turn toward the ocean that you are. Very gently begin to deepen the breath. And as you take a couple of consciously longer, deeper breaths, become aware of the inhale and the exhale moving through the body. And then with your next exhale, join your hands together at your heart. Gently bow your head over to your heart. Pause there for a moment. And then as you release the hands down, let the eyes open, keeping the gaze soft. And then slowly lift the head. Thank you. Any closing comments or thoughts before we end? Okay. Well, thank you so much for being present tonight. Next week, we look at the principle of maintaining or sustaining life after it's been created.